me at cello, cello. You had me at cello. You had me at cello. Oh, you had me at cello. Good afternoon, everybody. Look at the time, 5 o'clock on a Friday, Cello Chat time. Today, I am very pleased to have on the program Adrienne Hyde. Adrienne, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing really well, and I can't wait to ask you some of these questions about your approach to playing cello and Baroque cello and the Gamba and all manner of cello shaped objects.
I'm
But first of
excited to
all,
chat.
can you tell how you got started in music and on your several instruments, and then your schooling that led you to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. So I was born into a family of non-musicians, but people who loved music. And my mom actually taught piano all when I was a kid growing up. She never studied piano super formally, but she was a really, really good piano teacher. And so when I was growing up, she put me in kinder music when I was like 6 months old, and she would sway with me to Mozart, you know. And by like 2 years old, you're like banging on drums and stuff like that. And by the time I was 5, I started studying piano with her. And all growing up, she would have students in the house constantly. And I have 2 older brothers, so it was a way for her to like keep an eye on us, but also be like contributing to our household income and stuff. And so I learned a lot by just watching my mom teach, and also kind of tacitly absorbing things. So I studied piano for like the first 7 years of my musical life. So until I was about 13, I think. Um, and I hated it by the time I was 13 because my mom would listen to me practicing, and she'd be in like the other half of the room, and she would call from the other room like that was the wrong note, and it would drive me nuts. I hated it. Because I mean, I'm a perfectionist in everything I do, and so I couldn't stand being told I had done something wrong, which has been a really big journey actually in studying music, was is being able to like accept criticism. That's never been my. I'm very sensitive, and so I hated piano by the time I was able to quit. But my mom had this rule that once you got to middle school, or you had the option in elementary school to switch to a different instrument, you could do that, and you still had to play a little bit of piano on the side. Uh, so my eldest brother chose violin, then my other brother chose flute, and my mom kind of pushed me into cello because she always really loved the cello. And I wanted to play violin, so I tried to play violin for a little while, and um, just realized that I was much more drawn to the cello.
Hmm.
And so I played cello a lot in school. I didn't have super consistent lessons, and I also I didn't take criticism well, and so I didn't get a lot out of my lessons when I was a kid, because I would get too sensitive. I was really rejection sensitive when I was a kid. And so I kind of sporadically would study with teachers from middle school and into high school. And then in high school, I had this really life-changing experience where I went to the Castleman Quartet program kind of on a whim, because this new teacher that I had started studying with in Virginia, where I grew up, his name was Kenneth Law, and he's kind of the greatest guy alive. And he studied with a bunch of the teachers who were at the Castleman program. And he was like, well, you know, you're looking for something to do this summer besides work, and you know, you could try out this program. I've heard that they're looking for one more cellist. And so he sent me over there, and I met Alan Harris, and it was kind of game over from there on, because I just thought his mind was so incredible, and I respected the way that he thought about music so much. And so the next year, my senior year of high school, I decided, okay, well, I'm going to audition for conservatories and just see what happens. And I got accepted to Eastman, and I knew Alan well because of that summer that I had spent studying with him. So I decided to commit there, and they gave me a very generous scholarship and stuff. So I was able to go there. So that's how I ended up at Eastman. And that was kind of incredible to me because I was really bad. Like, I really didn't know what I was doing at all. I don't think I'd ever like memorized a fingering to a scale at that point in my life. Like, I would just kind of go on vibes.
By ear.
Which Yeah, I learned a lot of things by ear, and I was really precocious when I was a kid, and so I would like watch people do things and try and mimic them a lot. And I've been doing that from a really young age. I don't know why, but like in everything, I would watch people and I would try and mimic them. And I think that's how I was able to kind of I always called myself like, you know how people talk about imposter syndrome? I was a real imposter. Like I really had no idea what I was doing. And like I had no clue. And so my first week at Eastman was like really jarring because I was walking around the practice rooms and there were only freshmen there at this point because it's orientation, right? And I was hearing like other cellists playing like Dvorak and like I think I heard someone playing Prokofiev's Sinfonia Concertante and I was just freaking out. Like and like whether they should have been doing that or anyways is a whole nother conversation. But people were like playing with their practice room doors open and stuff. I was so intimidated. Um, and I really, really didn't feel like I fit in at all. And I remember my first week at Eastman, my 18th birthday was after the end of that first week of classes. And my mom drove up to Eastman. I don't know why I'm telling you this story, but my mom drove up to Eastman to celebrate my birthday with me because I like didn't have any friends yet. And I remember sitting in a hotel room with her and just crying my eyes out and being like, I don't belong here. Please, please take me home. Like I don't fit in. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like so lost. And she said no. And yeah, and I just like cried for like an entire weekend and just like begged her to take me home. And she said no. So, anyways, I'm telling you this story. It has a point. Because the next week was the first meeting of Eastman's Collegium Musicum. And while I was there in orientation, there was this orientation leader, Lydia Becker, who's a Baroque violinist. And she kind of saw that I was struggling a little bit, that I was like feeling like, oh no, I don't know if this is right for me. And she kind of dragged me like quite literally to this meeting of the Eastman Collegium Musicum. Like I think she found me in the dorm and like pulled my arm and was like, "You're coming." And and while I was there, I met Paul Odette and Crystal Thielmann, who are two of like the greatest early musicians in the history of the historical performance movement. Like they're kind of gods. They still are gods to me. I really revere and respect both of them.
Yeah.
And I was just like hooked from the very beginning. And so Baroque music became kind of my savior while I was at Eastman because I didn't feel like I was ever going to catch up to all the other cellists who were my age because I just didn't have the training and I didn't feel like I had the chops either. But I felt like when I started learning how to play Baroque music, it was there are rules that govern it and within which you can construct your own world kind of. And it was like someone taught me the language and then I could start speaking myself. And I had never really felt that way with cello. Like I had no one had ever like sat me down and taught me the verbs and the you know adjectives and stuff. So I didn't really feel like I knew how to construct what I wanted to say with modern cello. And Baroque cello was my entry into actually understanding how to do that on modern cello because we would break things down into these little tiny, you know, 3 notes. Can you play 3 notes beautifully and say something with them and follow these rules? And it changed my life. It gave me this like confidence that then, you know, I would be able to do something with music that felt meaningful. So anyways, I owe everything to Lydia. I like to tell her she ruined my life because now I'm like stuck in this Baroque cello universe where I'm so obsessive about all these like historical performance practices and stuff. But yeah, so while I was at Eastman, I spent like every second I could playing Baroque cello at the same time as I was studying modern cello. And the Baroque cello is what really led me to have a close connection to my TA in Alan Harris's studio. Cora Swenson Lee was my TA. And she also noticed that I was struggling a lot, but that I was interested in Baroque cello. And she took me aside and basically she gave me weekly lessons, sometimes twice a week lessons on technique and on modern cello and sometimes on Baroque cello. And she helped me feel like I could catch up to everyone else and helped me rebuild my technique and understand how to actually like practice and how to play scales, how to play arpeggios, how to practice right hand stuff. Yeah, everything. So she was my real like savior as well while I was at Eastman, and helped me feel like I could have a musical voice, and she gave me the technique that I needed to like actually express myself. And then, you know, once I had built that baseline with her and Professor Harris constantly making me play open strings and scales, once I had built that baseline, it was like game over. I was super excited, and I was super passionate about Eastman for the rest of my time there. And yeah. And then after that, I went to Juilliard, and I did a double major in Baroque cello and viola da gamba, where I studied with Sarah Cunningham and Phoebe Carai, who are two of the most incredible early musicians, again, of their era and of the HP movement. And yeah, and now I play mostly, I would say like 80% of what I do is early music, and then about 20% of what I do is modern cello playing. And that includes also doing romantic period practice and classical period practice as well. So I kind of have different outfits for my cellos.
Sure. Several bows.
All the bows.
Yeah.
I like to play a different bow on every week, and it's fun for me.
Nice. And now you're a cello fellow.
Yeah, I was a cello fellow. Well, I'm now actually, I'm calling in from my office at the Baltimore Symphony, where I work in community engagement and education, which is another facet of what I learned to love while I was at Eastman and at Juilliard especially. And at Juilliard, I was like really deeply involved in the community engagement programs. So I taught in the music advancement program for 3 years. And I started a little Baroque orchestra in there with Baroque bows, and I got a bunch of teenagers playing like Handel and Bach and stuff using Baroque bows, and it was like the coolest thing ever for me, at least. I don't know if they thought it was cool, but I was geeking out the entire time because it was really cool to watch kids getting involved in performance practice. Yeah. And then, so I was a cello fellow for 3 years, which is a really fun sentence to say. And I taught in New York City public schools. I taught cello, and I taught young people's concerts, pre-concert lessons and post-concert lessons. And then I also was a Gluck Community Service Fellow, which meant that they sent me out into different community spaces to perform and to interact with different communities. And through that, I was connected with the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Hospital, where I've been a volunteer for about 2 years now. And I try to go there. Now that I live in Baltimore, I go there less often, but I used to go there about once a month to perform and play and talk with the patients. And it was really, I loved my time at Juilliard because I got to do all this community building. And now that's what I like to do with my cello career, is building community and educating people, and also learning from other people. I get these great opportunities to go out and hear in Baltimore, especially, all these art forms and music forms that are in like indigenous is kind of the wrong word, but like native to the area, right, and that have been passed down orally for decades, you know, thinking of jazz, especially in Baltimore. And it's incredible to get to just absorb all of that. So that's what I spent most of my time at Juilliard doing. When I wasn't playing concerts, I was out in the community trying to, I don't know, connect with people. So that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, I want to come back to that community engagement. I have a question on that too. But let's see. So yeah, Cora has been a guest on this program as well, and she's wonderful as well. And what was it you were saying about Alan Harris's studio having inadvertently produced a whole bunch of early music cellists?
Yeah, there's like 4 or 5 of us I can think of, and I'm sure way more, but a lot of people just seemingly took up Baroque cello. And I think it was because Alan himself was always experimenting with strings, and he was also always experimenting with different like endpoint heights and stuff like that, and things that like early musicians love to do. And he also really, I would say as a teacher, he was really technically focused. He really didn't tell you how to play things. He taught you like what to do to make the sound that you wanted, but he refused to tell you how to play it. And I really appreciated that because I felt like I had a musical voice and I just wanted to be shown how to make things happen the way I envisioned them in my head.
Yeah.
But I think that's a very HP kind of viewpoint too, the idea that like no one's going to tell me what to do. I want have this idea in my head and there are these rules that I can follow and these techniques that I can follow, but at the end it's going to be a product of me that I'm putting out there on the stage, because we get so little direction in our music. Like we get so few markings, we get so much trust from the composer. And I think that in a kind of, if I can make a logical leap, that's kind of what Alan Harris does with his students is like he gives you the structure, the skeleton, the technique, the ability to do it, and then he sets you loose. And so I think a lot of us got set loose and fell into Paul Odette's his studio and ended up as Baroque cellists.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. I'll follow up now. I think it makes the most sense on the idea of the outreach, because in your bio, you say working to, or you talk about enjoying helping to bring classical music, art music to populations that don't traditionally have as much access to it. And I mean, I know sometimes I ask questions that are, there's no short or simple answer to, but how do you do that? You know, how do you do that?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is, well, I think a lot of it is not viewing yourself as having something to share so much as having a conversation starter. And I like a lot of the work that I do here in Baltimore is just starting conversations with communities and asking what they need and what they would like to see us do, and then seeing what I can do on my part to bring it to them. Because when you go into different communities, you need to view it as an exchange and not as like, you're dumping your classical music into their community. Like that's great. That's a great first step. Sure. Like bringing music to your community is a great first step, but it's also kind of implying that you have something worthwhile to share, but they don't have anything worthwhile to share with you. And what I love about early music in particular is that I think it's a great vehicle for this. Like when I go and improvise over a ground bass or something like that, I'm taking in what's going on around me. And that's one of my favorite things to do out in a community is improvise over ground basses and try and take inspiration from what's going around me. And also because they're very simple, you can have community musicians come and do the same thing back to you. And it doesn't matter what they play, if it's historically correct or anything, but it's inspiring, and it kind of merges two different art forms often. And it allows people to have access because you can sing, you can play an instrument, you can do all these different things. And anyways, sorry, I'm a like notorious rambler. I'm horrible at that. So
it's great.
But I just, yeah, I think so much good can be done by just like starting conversations and asking people what they would like to see in their community, and then going and doing it and not trying to tell them that you have a better idea. I think a lot of arts organizations go into communities thinking like, oh, I know exactly what program is going to speak to this community, but they don't ever show the program to the community beforehand and ask them, what in this do you think would be worthwhile for your population? And it's partly a humility thing where you have to be willing to like take criticism, and I'm really bad at that, so it's really funny that I'm saying that right now. But I just love going to talk with people and connecting with people. I think that's like all I've ever wanted in my life, is to be really connected with other people. I just love knowing people. I think that's really a beautiful thing when you know someone and you know things about them. And so when I'm trying to do community engagement and education, I'm not really thinking of it as education ever, even though there are, things that I want a population to learn from my visit. I'm always thinking of it as a conversation. I'm always going to them first and saying, is this useful to you? Is this something that you think you would gain something from, and that you think I would gain something from doing and from visiting you guys and getting to be a part of your community? Is this something that I would also gain something from, in terms of being a better human, a better musician, a better listener, a more empathetic person? Like, you know, I just, yeah, I think music is about humanity. It's about like connection, and that's why I love early music especially, but also I love community engagement, and that's why I've always wanted it to be like a really central part of my career. And I think it's so important for arts organizations to put so much emphasis behind it, because otherwise what's the point? Like, you're playing to an empty audience. You're not changing people's minds or hearts, and what's the fun in that, you know? Like,
I
I don't
think
know.
I think that's well said. And it's funny. Many years ago, I would occasionally teach a class on music appreciation, and it always struck me how, by and large, Baroque music could really resonate and connect with a lot of people very quickly.
Yeah,
So I bet you find that as well.
definitely. And I'm not even sure what it is about it, but I have a few ideas. And I think number one is that it's very accessible. You can walk out of a Baroque concert and hum
Yeah.
something that you've heard. And I actually think that's a lovely thing. Like, I love that. I love that it turns into earworms for people, because it means they're going to think about it again and maybe want to come back. And I also think early musicians have to make the case very often to not just like the world, but to their own colleagues in the modern orchestral classical music world. They have to make their case very often about why it's important to care about these things. And I think that makes us good communicators often. And I don't want this to sound like I'm bashing anyone who plays modern instruments in any way, because I think a lot of modern musicians I know are excellent communicators. But I think the very fact of having to kind of make your case all the time and say, like, okay, well, no, I care about these sociological things and all this other stuff that goes into that music of that time. I think it makes you a good communicator, because you have to explain, no, it's worthwhile to try and hear things from a different perspective, from a historical perspective, from a modern perspective, from like, it's important. It makes you try and understand people better and understand music better and where people are coming from. And I think that makes you more empathetic. And yeah, I
Nice.
like stories. So
Nice. Yeah. We're telling stories with music. Yeah. So you have a lot of very fine video recordings of yourself playing a wide variety of things online. And I would like to talk with you a bit. I would like to talk right hand a bit. Because for one thing, they're not just in early music, but often there's a lot of like dance music, early music, where we need to activate the string with just a high energy motion. And I like how your motion in your right arm just always seems very naturally to be doing the level of speed, the location, bow distribution that you need it to do. So I suppose in part, I want to stop there with that as a, to what extent do you think about choreographing, speaking with your bow arm?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. So thank you.
All right.
I spent so much time on my bow arm when I was at Eastman. So I'm glad to hear that it looks cool and sounds okay. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of really strong dogmas about right arm technique that I think in my head when I'm playing and also when I'm teaching. Like, one of my main ideas is well, one of my main exercises that I make all my students do is that like hinging of the elbow and trying to understand how to really gather your weight over the bow so that you always have access to it, but you can take it away when you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And with Baroque music, because so much of it is really carefully choreographed in terms of having a strong and a weak beat, you have to be really, really in control of the weight in your arm. The bow does some of the work for that itself, because your tip in a Baroque bow is supposed to be lighter than your frog is. So it naturally has a decay to it. But in order to really get the style, you have to be able to create that decay yourself. And so I think actually studying the rules of Baroque music and then classical music and romantic music and the historical performance practice of that really helped me to be better about bow distribution and controlling the weight of my bow. And also, I have a lot of mental pictures in my head when I'm playing about weightlessness in my arms, like the idea that I can just hold my arms up like this forever, just in the air. I can hold them up and they'll never get tired because they're kind of just supported by something. I don't know what it is, but they're supported by something. And I think that helps me a lot with gut strings because gut strings, you can't crush them. You have to have the right combination of weight and speed. And you have to do it a lot in order to know that combination. And it changes from day to day too. And it's about having that sensitivity in your fingertips to know what's going on with the string, and also having the ability to manipulate the weight in your upper arm based off of what your feedback you're getting from your fingertips. Because I think all bow technique is upper arm. I don't do anything with my fingers really. I don't like to move my fingers on the bow. And I know a lot of people have really different ideas about bow technique, but I've never been a huge person. I don't have a ton of arm weight. And I've always found that if I try and use my fingers, I get really tired and my sound is really weak. Or it's really one dimensional. It only ever sounds like I have weight in the bow or I have no weight in the bow. And so I keep my hand still and I use kind of the pivoting of my wrist in order to do what other people do with their fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I spent a lot of time playing on open strings and just testing out like getting leverage by flipping my elbow over top of my right hand. So trying to think of how to describe this to an audio format, but I think of there's like a hinge in the middle of my arm and I'm bringing my shoulder back while also bringing my elbow up. So what ends up happening is it's like you have a puppet string right here and you can move your forearm just back and forth and you have access to all the weight. But as you go out, if you drop your elbow, the weight goes out. If you lift your elbow up, the weight goes in, right? So it's all about figuring out that leverage of where your elbow is in relationship to your hand in order to put the weight into the bow. And when you become really aware of that, I think it opens up a lot of sound dimensions because you can decay the bow at the tip. You can make the bow, you can make it louder at the tip. You can do whatever you want, but you have to understand how to leverage your weight. And I think working a lot with young cellists, a lot of them get frustrated about having to use the bow at the tip because it feels really uncomfortable. And if you can teach them to get their weight centered over their hand, you unlock the tip for young cellists. And so that's one of the main first things that I do with most of my students is kind of puppet doll arms where they have to kind of do the chicken wing. I actually learned that from Kathy Kemp, who is like one of the greatest cello teachers of all time, up in Rochester, New York. And she does this chicken wings exercise all the time. And it's so perfect because it teaches you, okay, well, first of all, I can move my arms and they won't get tired. I can use my big muscle, it won't get tired. And if I do this enough, I can do it for hours every day. And it also helps you really understand how to pivot your arm and center your weight. I think when it comes to like activating the string too, I did a lot of work with gut strings on like feeling weight in my center fingers, my second and third finger, because if you put your weight into your first finger, your index finger, your pointer finger, index, pointer. I'm really, yeah. I have a funny story about naming finger numbers later. But if you put weight into that first finger, you will often get what we call chiff at the beginning of a note, which is that sound. That's going to come across great on the podcast. That
No, we all know what you mean.
Yeah, and so with modern bows, especially, if you can feel like you're dragging your hand behind your arm, it helps eliminate that noise while also getting the bow started really quickly. And I learned that from Baroque cello. I learned how to put my second and third finger in, have the weight centered there. And that really helped me learn how to not like crush the string with my modern bow as well. And of course, I think the funny thing about technique is that you can say all this stuff, and for me, it'll be true. And for someone else, it'll be complete, hogwash. Like someone else will listen to this and be like, that's ridiculous. That's never worked for me. And that's fine. Other people have technique that's completely hand centric, that's completely like their wrist is loosey goosey. They put all their weight in their first finger, or they put all their weight supinated in the back of their hand, and that works for them, but it's never worked for me. And so that's how I teach it to my students. And I talk a lot about like puppet arms and keeping your weight up and leveraging it and not getting tired, because you're not pulling your shoulders forward, but you're using your back muscles to really support your arms being in the air for hours, and they never get tired. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, our guest artist a few weeks back at our cello day, Robert Demain, one of the many things he mentioned was that we should all play on gut strings and learn what they have to teach us. Because in some ways the steel strings can be very forgiving, and you can have
they hide a lot.
Yeah, quite a lot of bad habits, and it like, I know what you meant. I'll go ahead and ring. Gut strings are not so accommodating all the time.
No, you have to really care for them, and it also really depends on like the humidity level and how your instrument, how happy it is that day, how much you've played that string. It's and I think in some ways, like, I was talking about like human to human connection earlier, and like really wanting to connect with people and being really sensitive and empathetic. I think gut strings is like being in a relationship. Like some days they're hot, some days they're cold, and you really have to figure out how to work with them no matter what, because you got a gig.
Yeah, and then on top of that, when we're practicing on our own, we tune to the sympathy. We get our instrument in tune, and we listen for the sympathetic resonance and everything. And then you get in an ensemble, and you're having to adjust to some other player or something.
Yeah, and I think that's where continuo comes really in handy, because what you're trying to do, if you're playing with an organ, or if you're playing with a harpsichord, or if you're a bow, you're trying to integrate your sound so much into theirs that it's creating this uniform bubble that's lifting up whatever solo voice is going on top. And it becomes very, very, very important how you emphasize certain beats, because you have so much power as a continuo player next to all these plucking players. And as the sustained, wow, I can't pronounce words, the sustained bass, your job is to link everything together and to put it all together, and you have so much power to make it really boring or really interesting by choosing one note to emphasize. And you got to go for that note, and you got to telegraph what note you're going for. And in order to do that, you have to know how to use your bow. Otherwise, every down bow comes out as emphasized, and every up bow comes out as not emphasized. And I find that really annoying and frustrating in modern cello playing technique too, that like all the notes sound the same, and then one note sticks out, and that's great. Like I love that. But what if each note sounded different and then built up to something and then came away, but every note was like kind of its own thing that didn't sound the same as the note before? It has to sound different in some way. And I think HP cellists think about that a lot, and modern cellists who are thinking about bow distribution think about it a lot, but it's something like that I think I was taught more when I was playing in continuo sections than I was when I was playing modern cello more often. But anyways, that's a big pet peeve of mine, is when people use the same amount of bow for so many different things. Like, use a different amount of bow, my man. Like,
it makes so much more vocal immediately.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm not gonna say that everyone has to play Baroque cello or everyone has to play on gut strings, but I think everyone should at least try it and understand the lineage of strings and where they came from. And I think also, I mean, playing on gut strings meant, for so long and doing so much of it, meant that I switched over to synthetic strings on my modern cello too, because I liked the impurity of it. I like the impurity of gut strings. I like that, like, I never know exactly what kind of sound is going to come out. Like, it's fun, I like things to sound different from day to day and night to night. I'm a different person the next day than I am the day before, and I don't like that metal strings sound the same all the time. I want them to sound different. I want there to be impurity. I want it to be imperfect. Like,
nice.
Yeah.
Cool. One more right hand question.
Yeah.
The choking up on the bow, being away from the frog. Do you find that there are benefits, that you have a studio as well, in terms of helping beginners, youngsters sometimes avoid certain bad habits? Like the fourth finger doesn't have to do as much counterbalancing of weight when we choke up further on the bow, and sometimes if there's some twist, they're doing something where there's torque on the bow, you can sense it more quickly if you're not holding the frog but you're holding the stick. Do you find that, just even like with a youngster learning modern cello, do you have them sometimes choke up for reasons like that?
I do. Usually it's so that they're really only using their upper arm to move the bow. I find if you have short arms, like at a certain point, you open up your arm to draw the bow, right? At a certain point, if you have shorter arms, you have to also open up the space between your upper arm and your forearm, right? And so often when I'm trying to get young cellists to really focus on only using their upper arm to move the bow, I have them choke up, because then they get to the tip and they've only used their upper arm to do it. It's a little trick that I do to mess with them a little bit, but I really want them to be able to segment. This is something that I feel passionate about. I want you to be able to segment your arm. I want to break everything down to the point where you can manipulate one variable and see how it changes the sound. And so I want people to learn, okay, well, this is what it sounds like when I only use my upper arm, but I'm not opening my arm. I'm like stuck here, I want people to know what it feels like to hit the point where they've completely hit the limit of what opening your upper arm can do, and then opening your forearm, and then bending your wrist. Like, I want people to be so in control of their body that they can segment all these different things and treat it like a science experiment, where I'm, this is my control. I'm keeping my upper arm consistent. I'm keeping my forearm consistent, but now I'm going to put more weight into my first finger on the bow and see how it changes the sound. Or I'm going to supinate more, so there's no weight in my first finger. I'm going to see how it changes the sound at the tip, like things like that. I like to think of things as science experiments. And so I'm constantly having kids like turn their bow around, hold it at the tip, and the frog is at the other end, see what it feels like to have way more weight at that end versus this end, I will say, I think too, like choking up on the bow to get a more historical sound, I think is kind of silly, because the modern bow is like so poorly weighted. Like, I mean, it's not going to make as big a difference as just giving your child a Baroque bow to use, And I give young cellists Baroque bows to use all the time, because I want them to understand what they're playing came from. I want them to know when they're playing a Bach minuet in Suzuki Book 4, I want them to know what a minuet is and to know that it's a dance and that they should have fun with it and embody that spirit of dancing. Like, so I'll take out my Baroque cello and I'll be like, this is what it would have sounded like back then. You know, how can we make it sound like that on our modern instrument? But I don't really believe necessarily in the choking up on the bow, except to teach technical things. Like what I was saying about the upper arm being in control and the deltoid being in control of the bow. And I think what's funny is I'm hearing myself saying these things and I'm thinking of all those times that Alan Harris and Cora would say things like this to me too, and be like, well, if you could just control your arm, you would be able to experiment more, but you haven't learned how to control all the separate parts of your arm. And so you're frustrated because you don't know what variable you need to manipulate in order to make it sound the way you want it to sound in your head. And yeah, I don't know. It's funny to hear myself like saying these things and like I've learned something, I think, but it's I learned it from these great masters. And
yep. I know exactly how you feel. I've been doing that same thing for decades. They live in your head.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because like I remember feeling so frustrated when I was at Eastman because of them saying some of these things to me and being like, well, if you practice your open strings, you know, and now I'm just saying it back to my students and I'm like, oh man, like they must hate me. But it's good for them. Yeah. And I'm really glad that I'm really glad that I went through that experience at Eastman where I kind of just completely relearned how to play, and well, not even relearned, but actually learned how to play, because now when I am talking to my students, I actually know what to say to them because I experienced it as an adult. I experienced learning how to play as an adult. And yeah.
All right. So what's coming down the pike? Upcoming performances, projects? What does summer and fall of 2024 hold?
Ooh, I'm trying to think now. So, well, I'm working a lot for the Baltimore Symphony in community engagement. I also will be traveling to New York to play with a group called the Sebastians. They're doing a whole concert recreating Lully, the guy who stabbed himself in the foot. They're recreating his orchestra, but minus the gangrene that killed him. So they're doing a concert called the 24 Royal Violins, which I'll be playing viola da gamba in, which is one of my other main instruments. And then I'll be traveling to Blue Hill, Maine to play the Gamba solo and second cello in the St. Matthew Passion, the very famous Kommt süßes Kreuz solo on Gamba. And then the week after, I'll be at the Aston Magna Festival playing German Schmelzer and all sorts of German Baroque music. And then after that, I travel to Vancouver to play at the Vancouver Early Music Festival, where I'll be playing one of the Bach Gamba sonatas, as well as some of the solo Abel sonatas for viola da gamba. I'll be playing Kommt süßes Kreuz again in a concert at the St. Matthew Passion. I'm not sure if we're doing an opera this year. I should probably check on that, but yeah, so it'll be a busy summer, but and very viola da gamba heavy and not as much cello playing, sadly. But it's nice to have different, you know, waves in your career. Like for the last few months, I've been playing a lot of Baroque cello, and so now it'll be nice to return to viola da gamba. And I often find I go through periods where I'm playing only Baroque cello or only gamba, and then I get to come back to modern cello or come back to Baroque cello or my romantic cello or something like that. And it's like I get to, you know, rebuild a relationship with it, and it's really fun for me. Other people do not find that fun, I've heard. But for me, it's like I have all these instruments laying around and I get to come home to them and I'm like, oh, I forgot how much fun it is to play you. Like,
right.
Yeah.
That's
what I'll be up to.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That I got caught up so much in the kind of, what do they call it? Nerding out in the right hand. Yeah. Motivating students. I'm sure your students, again, so many of us, we hopefully try to model the motivation and our own enthusiasm, excitement for music and the instrument. But Do you have some advice, some tips, some go-tos for when you have a student who could use just a little bit of help getting motivated to practice?
Ooh, well, I mean, sometimes I struggle with motivation to practice too. So I am not the most focused person. My focus often goes in lots of different directions. So I'm horrible at focusing in practice sessions, and I'm not too proud to admit it. I will watch TV while I practice sometimes. And you know what? It's fine. We can all admit it. We do it sometimes, right? Um, no, but I don't tell my students to do that. Don't worry. I often uh, find that part of the self motivation thing is helping them escape perfectionism,
Mm.
and saying, okay, well, that's good enough for now. We'll revisit this in a few weeks and come back to it, because a lot of things progress naturally if you take a break from them, actually. I also personally have to structure my practice time really carefully because I am so busy. I'm playing gigs. I work a full-time job. I play 5 different instruments professionally right now. I play Gamba, I play Baroque cello, I play modern cello, I play lirone, I play bass violin. So for me, finding time to practice and prepare for gigs and triage for gigs and
Mm.
is a really big thing. So I try to teach my students how to triage most of all, and say, okay, well, this is the thing that I'm going to break it down. This is the real problem. And I'm I'm a big fan of being meticulous like that, like breaking things down to like what is actually wrong here. And I find with students, if you can lead them down the path of being like, well, what didn't go so well and what could I do better, and kind of just hinting at what you think they need to work on, but not actually saying it, often gets much better results. Like if you let them lead themselves down the path of being like, well, this is actually, maybe this is what I need to work on, they're much more motivated to do it instead of you telling them to do it. So with a lot of my students, I'm like, well, have you listened to this recording, and what did you like about it, and how do you think maybe you could emulate that more? And that often will get them their wheels turning to think, okay, well, this is actually how I want to sound, and what do I have to do to get there? And then that is self-motivating enough, you know. But I don't know, if you ever come up with some good strategies, you let me know, man. I yeah, it's hard.
It can be,
Yeah,
it can be, right?
yeah,
Because the key, as you say, is self-motivating, helping them learn to motivate themselves.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm usually pretty honest with my students too. I tell them, I'm like, sometimes there are pieces that I am dreading having to learn how to play, and if I have to do it, I will do it. And the way that I force myself to do it is by scheduling time and putting that in my calendar. I say, okay, I'm gonna get home from work at 5 p.m. I'm gonna give myself a 30-minute break. 5:30 to 7, I am learning that gamba solo. You know, like I'm sitting myself down and forcing myself to do it, and talking to them about how that's an important life skill and talking to their parents about, because I teach a lot of kids too, and I say to the parents too, like, it might be painful, but if you can schedule this practice time in and say you're going to do this, it's an important life skill, because you're not always going to enjoy what you're doing, but you have to do it, you know. So for young kids, I often find it's more about talking to the parents about how to talk to their children about it too. um, so I often say, like, you know, your kid's going to complain about this, but they need to do it. And you need to softly encourage them to do it and say, you know, I know it's hard. I know you're like frustrated, but if you just do 5 more minutes, it'll get 5% better. And then Adrienne will be proud of you because you made progress, you know? So I don't know. It's a journey, like with every student too, you know, every kid is different and every cellist is different. I mean, but I'm really honest with my kids too. I tell them when they don't show up, and I tell them when they do show up, and I think that also wins their allegiance in some ways, you know. And being real with kids really helps them, I think, take what you're saying seriously. So
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of excellent points, a lot of things takeaways and very well said too. So thank you so much for your time, Adrienne.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Have fun. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say I'm really surprised that any of that was coherent because I'm such a bad rambler. Sorry, Mom.
No. And like what you say, being honest and also being from the heart. You know, we want to hear not we hear just the raw thoughts, what's going on in your head as you're playing, as you're thinking, as you're teaching. That's what my students watching these videos need to hear. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, I am the worst focused person in the world. Like, I'm really bad at focusing, and I struggled for a long time with that in performance settings. But then I realized that, you know, there's so much distraction in performance settings. If I can distract myself while I practice and still perform at a high level, then I will have made it. And I actually think that's the number one, like, unrated tip that people don't share with like students and stuff, is that if you can actually practice being distracted and like still performing at a high level, you will be happy with how you perform even when you're focused. You know, you will trust yourself to do it correctly no matter what is going on around you. And so it's funny because I'm saying all this stuff about practicing, but I practice distracted and I perform sometimes distracted, but it's part of who I am, and that's how my brain works. I'm not very good at focusing, and it would be inauthentic for me to like be super intense and focused on stage. And I like to be having fun, and I trust myself to do it. I built the technique over years, and I practiced the technique of being able to perform no matter what's going on mentally for me. And like, that's how I'm able to have fun on stage and like put it all aside and be happy with how I played. And I think people don't say that often enough. Like, I'm not 100% focused on stage. I'm having fun. Like, I'm having a good time. My mind is in 30 different directions, and because I play continuo, that's a good thing. But you know, I think, yeah, we have this idea of like the singular artist who's like completely focused on their craft and like is so dedicated to it, and like, you know, they're so intense all the time, like all they can talk about is cello, and you know, and that's not me. Yeah, I'm really distracted. Like, I'm really easily distracted, but I'm really happy with the products I put out because I trust myself that even when I'm distracted, it's coming from my heart and it'll come out the way I want it to, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That's excellent. Plenty to think about as everybody practices all weekend, all week long until we meet up this time next Friday. Thanks again, Adrienne, and we'll see everybody else next Friday. Take care.
You had me at Cello.